Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Pennsylvania Press Club. I'm John Baer, the club president and your host for today's luncheon. Joining me at the head table is Jeanette Krebs of Krebs Communication and Public Engagement. Thank you for being here and for your support. Pennsylvania Press Club Luncheon Series could not be possible without the generous donations of our sponsors on our sponsor banner. Today's luncheon is being broadcast throughout Pennsylvania to the television audience of PCN. Our speaker today is the director of the Franklin and Marshall College Center for Opinion Research, Berwood Yost. In addition to directing the center and the Floyd Institute for Public Policy at Franklin and Marshall, he also teaches courses in research methods and public health. He's also conducted funded research on behalf of governments, business, nonprofit organizations, public utilities, and higher education, media, and more. His clients include major private and public organizations and institutions in the fields of health, education, and business. His research articles have appeared in such publications as the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, the American Journal of Public Health, Human Rights Quarterly, and many others. He's also written for The Polling Report, Pollster.com, Public Opinion Pros, and Survey Research. The results of his research have appeared in major newspapers, including the New York Times, USA Today, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and others. But for our purposes, he directs the Franklin and Marshall poll, formerly the Keystone poll, which has been around for decades, gets lots of attention during election years, and like all polls, has sometimes been questioned, cursed, and controversial. But he agreed to come here anyway. So please welcome Berwood Yost.
Good afternoon. Thank you, John. The list of previous press club speakers is impressive and a bit humbling, honestly, and I'm honored to be on that list, so thank you for inviting me to speak today. My remarks emphasize two related topics. First, I'm going to discuss what we know about the historical successes and failures of primary election polling. And second, I'm going to provide some of my thoughts about ways we might make better use of these polls, given their limitations. There's unprecedented interest in Pennsylvania's upcoming primaries, if you look at the number of candidates running, and among the journalists, like many of you here, trying to make sense of it all. This means that any and all polling data, when it appears, becomes a central talking point, either to be elevated or eviscerated, depending on the reader's particular interest. This increased interest seems to make now the right time to think about what the polls can and cannot tell us about these primary races. Many of you probably recall the high-profile primaries of the 2016 election cycle in Pennsylvania. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were both expected to easily win their respective primary, as the polling averages showed both candidates with comfortable double-digit leads. At the same time, you may remember that the individual polls were remarkably scattered around the polling averages. In 2016, the polls during the last month showed a Trump lead ranging from 8 to 26 points, he won by 35, and a Clinton lead ranging from 6 to 28 points, she won by 12. In the end, the polls overestimated Clinton's margin of victory and underestimated Trump's. Of course, that's only a single election in a single state. But if you had a longer-term perspective that included polls from multiple states in all the presidential primaries conducted since 2000, you would find that the patterns I just described for the state's presidential primaries are consistent with general patterns seen this century in primary polling. We can gain this longer-term perspective by using data from the 538 polling database. I'm focused on presidential primary polls because there's much less comparable data available for Senate and gubernatorial races. If we had such data, my bet is that we would see similar, if not more pronounced patterns like those I'm about to describe for Senate and gubernatorial elections. So when you analyze the primary polling data since 2000, three patterns become really quite clear. First, primary polls tend to be more accurate the closer it gets to election day. probably not too surprising. But second, there is a lot of variability in primary polling estimates. Even though primary polls are more accurate as the election nears, in every primary there were a considerable number of polls conducted in the last week of the election that missed the final results by double-digit margins. Third, and perhaps a bit surprising, is that primary polls often tend to underestimate the lead of the winning candidate. We can also learn more about primary polling when we compare their performance to the performance of general election polls in these same election cycles. Such a comparison shows that general election polls are usually more stable, less scattered, and closer to the final outcome than primary election poll results. So, despite all the concerns expressed in recent years about general election polls, it is clear that they are better indicators of final elections outcomes than our primary polls. Now, why is that? Well, primary surveys are less accurate and, from my perspective, more difficult to conduct than general election surveys for at least 3 reasons, each of those having to do with voter uncertainty. First, voters do not pay much attention to primary elections, so they are more likely to be influenced by election reporting, by new information, and by notable events. Big events and perceptions of momentum can swing voters from one candidate to another. Swings in polling margins are one result of this inattention. I'm willing to bet that Saturday's announcement that President Donald Trump has endorsed Mehmet Oz in the Senate race is likely to shake up that race. Second, uncertainty about candidate preference happens in closed primary states like Pennsylvania because people are voting for candidates who represent their chosen party. Primary candidates' issue positions are much more similar than they are when candidates from opposing parties face each other in a general election, which you know. This increases voter uncertainty about who they will vote for and also makes their preferences less stable and less certain. And finally, voters in primaries are less certain about whether they're going to actually vote. A vital task in getting an accurate picture of candidates' support is determining who will vote, but primary elections make it harder to figure this out because far fewer people vote in primary than general elections. Primary turnout in even years since 2000 has exceeded 40% only once among Republicans and 3 times among Democrats in Pennsylvania. Compare that to general elections during the same time period where turnout has never been below 40% of all registered voters. This means that pollsters working in a primary election have a harder time telling who will or will not vote. And this point is really essential. To get accurate results, pollsters must talk to those who will vote and identify those who will not. Now, of course, voter uncertainty is not the only thing that matters. Technical choices in how voters are sampled and interviewed, how questions are designed, how likely voters are estimated, and how the results are interpreted also contribute to some of the differences we see in polling outcomes. But polling can only produce accurate results when the voters themselves are sure about their intentions. The truth is that in primary elections, voters take much longer to make up their minds and wait much closer until election day to do so. The variability we see in election polling simply reflects voter uncertainty. A conversation I recently had with a poll worker helps underscore this point. He said he was helping a woman at his polling place after his county received new voting machines. And as he was showing her how to use the machine, she said, "Stop, just show me how to vote straight Democratic." This gentleman said, "You can't." She, of course, began arguing, telling the poll worker that she could vote for whoever she wanted. And he said, "Ma'am, it's a primary." Her response, "Now how do I know who to vote for?" So given voter uncertainty and the primary poll's performance over time, it seems reasonable to consider more than simply which candidate is in the lead to understand an election. We should acknowledge that election outcomes are the product of how voters evaluate electoral circumstances as well as how they evaluate the qualities of candidates. The unique context of every election cycle can serve as an equally important tool for understanding what is happening and why it is happening. regardless of how well the polls capture final election margins, they invariably tell us important stories about the circumstances that are driving voters' preferences. It would be a shame to ignore that context. This is because regardless of how well polling hits the mark on the margins between candidates, they always tell us useful and important things. For example, the 2016 polling was really clear about many features of the campaign, even if the final outcome was a surprise to some people. We knew both major party candidates were historically unpopular, and that unpopularity meant large portion of voters would need to choose between two candidates they did not like. The polls clearly showed that there were historically large numbers of undecided and third-party voters. The 2016 polls also clearly showed that there was a strong desire for change. Most citizens believed the country was on the wrong track. Many citizens felt economically insecure, and negative views about President Obama's job performance were shaping people's preferences for change. And finally, the polls clearly showed that the race was tightening as election day neared. The same is true from 2020. Even though the polls were correct for the most part that Joe Biden was going to carry the state, they also offered us lots of other important information. In 2020, we saw that attitudes about the state's directions changed negatively after growing satisfaction during the first 3 years of the Trump administration. We knew President Trump was personally unpopular, although his job approval made him competitive. We saw that Joe Biden was doing better in the counties Hillary Clinton won in 2016 than President Trump was doing in the counties he won that year. We also knew the president's supporters were enthusiastic about supporting his candidacy, while Biden's supporters were enthusiastic about voting against the president. Finally, we saw more voters expected to vote or cast their ballot in person than by mail, but we saw strong partisan differences in these choices. So these and other indicators provided important information and a relatively clear understanding of the electoral context in both election cycles, and should have been discussed, I think, more often. So given this past experience, there are a number of contextual stories I think we should be paying attention to and reporting about as this primary election approaches. So I'm going to be paying attention to candidate awareness and favorability ratings, because lesser known and unpopular candidates rarely win. I'm going to be paying attention to issues that are driving vote choice and whether any one candidate seems to have an advantage on a specific issue. I will be paying close attention to whether voters in different geographic areas of the state express any differences in their interest in the election and motivation to vote. And perhaps most importantly, I will be paying attention to how the different factions within each party are thinking about issues and candidates, including how motivated they are to vote. Can any candidate appeal to the Trump and mainstream Republican faction on the Republican side, or the progressive and moderate faction on the Democratic side? These are the things I'll be thinking about. And in fact, if we think more broadly about the general election, I'm going to be closely watching whether the president's job approval ratings improve, since such ratings are closely tied to election outcomes in off-year elections. I'll be closely watching whether changes in party identification continue to favor Republicans in this state. I'll be closely watching how much interest in the election differs by party and ideology. I'll be closely watching whether voters' feelings about their personal finances improve, and I'll be closely watching whether new issues or personalities emerge that can change voters' preferences. So, to sum up, I find it baffling that so many people focus on the horse race question when polling can provide so much more, including context that is essential for understanding an election. Truth is, no one trying to forecast a future event is ever wise to rely on a single indicator to make their judgments. So why should elections be any different? I think we would all feel differently about the contributions the polls make to our understanding of elections if we allowed ourselves to broaden our perspective and think more about more than just who is in lead at any given time. In the long run, polling has more often advanced our understanding than misled us, including in 2016 and 2020. The task for everyone who understands polling and the limitations of the horse race mindset is to do more to make sure that voters understand not just who is winning, but that they also understand those elements that have helped a candidate to the lead and those elements that could keep them from winning. I guess what I'm asking is that reporters and poll readers treat polls as they would any other source by making sure they understand and fully report the entirety of the stories that a poll can tell. Thank you. I don't get to sit? Okay. Thanks, John.
Now, normally on first-timers, we start off with softballs, but I know Berwood, so we're not going to do that.
Thanks, John.
In the history of the Keystone poll and the F&M poll, what has been your biggest miss and your best hit?
So I think I should say I reject the premise of the question, actually, if I'm being honest about what I just said, right? We shouldn't focus on the horse race. But that said, I think in 2016, we finished polling the day Jim Comey announced that he was reopening the investigation of Hillary Clinton. And our numbers were off. And you could see, if you followed the polling averages that year, how the race was starting to tighten. And then at that point, there was an inflection, and it really tightened and moved Trump's way. So one thing that we've always done at Franklin Marshall is we've made it a point not to interview in the last 2 weeks of an election. Now, I just told you, all the evidence is that your data gets better the closer you get to Election Day. We decide not to do that because we really don't want to be the story. We want to understand the context. If we wanted to get better at our misses and hits, we would probably poll through Election Day, but we don't do that. In terms of our best, I think it was the 2012 Wolf election was right on. I think the 2018 elections were pretty close too. But again, I reject the premise of the question.
Fair enough. As media becomes more strident and bombastic, how can the practice of polling serve a purpose beyond partisan bludgeoning?
Well, I hope the story that I told today about the many ways that the polling helped us understand the context of an election is really the way to go. I'd like to see us focus less on the horse race. I'm not naive. People want to know who's ahead. We're all interested in that. But I think we have to do a couple of things better. We have to be better about the imprecision of polling. These are blunt instruments. They're not precise instruments. All polls have some variability, right? We have to accept that. And so if we accept that, and we accept that polls can tell us other things, some of the things that I talked about today, other things that we might not be thinking about now, I think we can make better use of them. But the truth is, some people will just attack the polls because they don't like what they say. I think the best I can do is make our methods transparent, so anybody can go and see how we ask our questions and how we do our data collection and when we do them and all that sort of thing, and they can judge for themselves the quality.
There's been a lot of discussion about the 2020 election polls undercounting Republicans, but now polls show a lot of wind in Republican sails. Have Republican votes started, or
is there a question in there?
Yeah, somewhere there it is. Have Republican voters started on you answering the phone again?
That's a good point. Look, I don't know if more Republicans are answering the phone, but Democrats aren't. That seems to be the thing that we are not, right? I think one of the things that's interesting about election polling is that, you do see changes in momentum by people who are willing and interested in participating. We can see the characteristics of people who want to participate in our polls. We track that every poll that we do. I map who responds and who doesn't geographically across the state and by demographic groups. And you do see changes. Right now, Democrats are having a really hard time interesting young people and urban voters, and that's killing them. At the same time, suburban voters seem to be moving a bit towards the Republicans in terms of, I've written about this notion of party registration, which you got to be registered to vote for a party in this state, as you all know, if you want to vote in a primary. At the same time, people have a party identity, which may be different than their party registration. And that party identity has moved towards Republicans a great deal in the last year. And part of that is because weakly identifying voters have decided that they don't like what the Dems are selling. And that comes, there's a lot of issues we can talk about there. But right now, yes, we see more Republicans willing to complete our polls and more interested, more excited about the elections, more engaged. And that typically leads to midterm losses for the party in power. I think that's what you're staring at right now if you're a Democrat.
Is there more interest in primary voting in primaries where there are more candidates?
Yes. Let me elaborate. We often don't have primaries like we have this time, thank heavens. I just got a text from someone who, a campaign text, which I keep getting all the time, as I'm sure you're getting. So it's unusual. We've never had a circumstance like we have right now in the modern era of Pennsylvania's Constitution, that is since 1968, where we had an open Senate and gubernatorial race. That's never happened. I think you have to go back. You and I talked about this once, John. Is it the 20s or the 30s till you had, I forget, but it has been a long time since you had this sort of open primary with these major statewide campaigns. And so that's certainly driving up interest. The spending is going to drive up voter interest as well, right? I mean, you can't turn on the TV and not see an ad for some candidate. And so that's going to also drive up interest. So I suspect we'll have better turnout than we've had in a while in these primary election campaigns. At the same time, I think there's probably a lot of confusion. All these candidates make it harder for voters to make a choice.
A couple of questions on the importance of the Oz endorsement by former President Trump. I'll kind of combine them and ask, is there polling data to support your view stated here that the endorsement is likely to shake up the race?
I don't have polling data yet since it just happened Saturday. But we've been tracking the factions within the parties for some time. My colleague Stephen Medvick and I have presented some academic work on the way that the state's voters have moved themselves into Trump and traditional Republican factions on one side and progressive and moderate Democratic factions on the other. And the Trump faction at one time was the largest Republican faction in the state. I think it was about 50% in June of 2020 of Republican voters. That number has declined a bit, but it's still sizable. It's still a third or more. So I think in a race that is very crowded, lots of candidates, any little thing can make a difference. And the Trump endorsement is actually a big thing. He has a lot of people who are interested in his views, and it's going to help some people make up their minds. So I think it has to be a tremendous advantage. I would think that polling, the next time we start looking at polls that ask about his endorsement, we're going to see it makes a difference. But I don't have that data yet. Talk about poll timing and bad luck. We completed a poll last night. So, we're not going to have any read on the Oz and the Trump endorsement, unfortunately. But at least we'll have a baseline we can compare next time and see how things have moved. But I will tell you, at this point, there isn't a clear front runner in that race. And the same is true on the Republican side and the gubernatorial contest. And even among those who've decided, and this is all races, I'm giving you a preview here. In all the races, we ask people, are you certain about who you're voting for? If they picked, are you certain or are you still making up your mind? And it's about half of the voters who've picked a candidate in Senate and the Senate primaries say, well, I could still change my mind. I mean, the past polling data says they are going to change their mind, but at least they admit it.
In your experience, what moves polls the most? Is it primarily TV ads?
I think TV advertising plays a huge role up to a point. I mean, there becomes a point when there's diminishing returns. I mean, the scholarly literature is pretty clear on that you need to reach some baseline to get known, but after some point, it sort of levels off. So I think you have to have a combination of, and there's some public relations professionals in the audience who would probably be happy to take this question, I'm sure. But I think you have to have a combination of solid advertising backed up by whatever, earned media you can get, good stories about your candidacy, coupled with, events that generate interest. So, but if I had to pick one thing, yeah, you got to be on the air.
Despite your aversion to people reading the horse race aspect of polls, can polls have the effect of actually producing winners?
No, I don't think so. I mean, 2016, does that come to mind? So no, I wish polls could be that influential, I suspect, but they're not. There's a lot of confirmation bias in the world, and if we see a poll that supports our view, we usually believe it, and if it doesn't support our view, we say, yeah, that guy's an idiot. I've gotten that email. Polls don't move people. Is it possible that some people might make a judgment? Maybe, but it doesn't move a lot of people.
What guarantees would you give voters in determining whether polling data is fair and accurate or skewed based on who's funding the poll and the pool of those polled, et cetera?
Yeah, look, I belong to a professional association that has a set of standards about the things that we tell people when we release a poll. And one of the things that we have to tell people is who sponsors it, right? Sponsorship can make a difference. The order that you ask the questions, the way that you ask the questions, the way you select a sample, who you consider to be a likely voter, for instance, all those things make a difference. So I think the more transparent we can be about our methods, the better the guarantee is that we didn't put our thumb on the scale. And I think that's what I would encourage everybody to do, is if you read a poll, look at what they've done and judge it. And if there's missing data, then maybe you don't trust it.
Are polls more or less accurate now that there are so few landlines?
Yeah. So that's a complicated question because there are fewer landlines, but it is sometimes easy. We have more ways of reaching people now. So in the old days, we used to just sample. We actually used to randomly generate telephone numbers, right? You knew the blocks where phone numbers were located. You could just generate the numbers, and you got a good random sample. But that's the only way we really reached people. Now, we have all kinds of technologies that allow us to link somebody's voter file to an address, obviously, a phone number, a cell phone number, maybe an email account. So we've got multiple ways of reaching people. So the work is harder, and we have to be more diligent in trying to get people to participate. But I don't think it's any different in terms of the quality of what it can deliver. It's just harder. You have to work harder at it.
And finally, what makes a great poll?
Timing? It's like what makes a great joke. I think the timing is important, right? I mean, I've got a few examples of where we've done polling and things have changed because of a major event, but that's rare. Oftentimes our politics is such that, the way people are voting doesn't change when the undecided voters make up their mind. Recently, that hasn't been the case, and that makes, polling harder, I think. So, long term, I think I think we just continue to report the way we do our work, make it clear and transparent. That's the way we're going to know it's working. That's the only way we can do it.
We thank Berwood Yost and wish him well. We have some mementos for him. These gifts are a compliment of transit dues, PCN, and the Pennsylvania Press Club. In closing, thank all of you for being with us. Our next luncheon is Monday, May the 23rd, when our guest will be the Committee of 70's David Thornburg. For scheduling, check our website at papressclub.org. Thank you, Berwood.
Thank you.